Today's topic is the topic of subsidies. A subsidy, by definition, is money that is given from a government to a group of people, a group of producers, essentially to help them produce more at a lower cost. You do sometimes hear about this, you do hear this word somewhat misapplied. People might talk about a subsidy to help consumers buy a car. That's fine if you think about it that way, but in a strict economic sense, a subsidy is going to be awarded to a producer, not a consumer. Also, when it is awarded, it's always going to be awarded on a per unit basis. So the government might tell a producer, we're going to give you 10 yuan. No, actually, I was going to use yen today. Same symbol. The government might say, we're going to give you 10 yen for every single one of these that you produce. So if you produce 1,000, well, you get 1,000 times 10, 10,000 yen. If you produce 1,000,000, then you get 10 million yen. They wouldn't give you just a lump sum up front because they want to make sure that you actually produce the goods that they are hoping to motivate you to produce. In economic terms, we're going to say that subsidies are going to lower the costs of production. It's not physically going to lower the cost. You still have to pay your workers the same. You still have to pay the same electricity or something like that. But if your per unit cost of production is 100 yen, and then the government gives you 10 yen, well then really what it cost you is negative 100 cost plus 10 yen. So it's going to cost you 90 yen to make something. So we have to think about it as lowering the cost. If we connect this back to our non-price determinants of supply, we remember that one of those is the reduction of input cost, or lowering the costs of making a good. So it's going to shift the supply curve, and here we're going to talk about it being a downward shift, and that's just kind of a mechanical reason that we'll get to later. A lot of our logic here is going to be just the opposite of the logic that we used in looking at the government imposing an indirect tax. So where an indirect tax shifted the supply curve up, here it's going to shift it down. Where an indirect tax was seen as an additional cost, here it's going to lower costs. Keep in mind that we have to think about price meaning two different things to two different people. So to consumers, they think of the price as what they pull out of their wallets and give to the person selling the good. The producers, though, they think of price as, well, what do we get every time we sell one of these goods? And we are talking about in terms of revenue, not profit, not yet. So remember, without government intervention, price it might mean two things to two different people, but the value of price is always going to be the same. Here, because the government is intervening, the value of the price is going to be different for consumers than it is going to be for producers. Let's go ahead and see what that means over here. So if the price that consumers pay is 110, well, the normal law of supply would say, well, then I will supply 1. I'm not going to supply too many because it costs me 100 to make it, so I'm only making a little bit of profit on top of this. So if the price is 110, I only supply 1. As the price goes up, the amount I supply goes up. This is our law of supply for the umpteenth time, and that's our argument there. But once we impose a subsidy, the price that consumers pay is not going to be the same as what the price that consumers pay won't be the same as the price that the producers get. They'll get the 110 yen from the consumer, but they're going to get an additional 10 yen from the government, therefore they're getting 120 yen. Well, we said down here that if I'm getting 120 yen, I would produce 2, so that must be true here as well. So that becomes 2. Likewise, if I get 120 from the consumer and 10 from the government, I get 130, therefore I produce 3. So what we see here is that just like what we saw with indirect taxes, is we can see that for each price, and here for price we're going to think about what the consumers pay. For each price, the quantity supplied is going to be greater. 2 is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 2, etc. And that's going to result, when you graph it, of a downward shift of the supply curve. The effects on the market are pretty easy to look at. Once we bring in a demand curve, obviously we see that the new supply curve, so this is supply with the subsidy, obviously we see the new supply curve will slide down the demand curve, and we're going to find a new market price at a lower price. So we see the market price will decrease from P star down to P2. Obviously, we're talking about the law of demand, so if price is decreasing, the result is going to be a greater quantity demanded, and we'll find an equilibrium quantity that is further to the right or greater than the original equilibrium. So Q star will move over to Q2. A few other things about the graph that can be confusing that we need to look at. Keep in mind that just like with indirect taxes, the amount the supply curve moved was equal to the amount of the tax. Likewise, this star here, so the distance between the original supply curve and the new supply curve, that's going to be the value of the subsidy. So if it's a 10 yen subsidy, that distance on the curve, and remember they're parallel lines, so that vertical distance is the same no matter what, that's going to be a value of 10 yen. Another odd thing that is going to occur here is this up here, P3. You have to remember that we have two different prices. P2 is the price that consumers pay, but it's not the price that producers get, and it doesn't really tell us what they will do. The original supply curve tells us what producers will do. So we have to go from the new quantity up to the original supply curve. So that tells us if this was 110 yen, well, we go from 110 yen up 10 more yen, and that gets us to 120. So P3 is what producers get. To calculate total revenue, we have to look at P3 times Q2. To calculate what consumers pay, we have to calculate P2 times Q2. Remember, our term for that is consumer expenditure. Well, what does the government pay then? How much did the government spend on this subsidy? Well, we can do it two ways. We know that the difference between what consumers spent and what producers got is going to be the difference of what the government gave to producers. So we could simply do P3 minus P2 to establish what the government spends. On the graph, though, we want to be able to see that as well. So remember, the subsidy is this vertical distance. If we bring that over, it's the distance from P2 to P3. That's the amount of the subsidy. So that's our rise of the subsidy. The run then is obviously from 0 all the way over to Q2. So this box, this rectangle that is formed by the dashed green line and then up the blue and across, that box is going to represent the government spending on the subsidy. So government expenditure is going to be P3 minus P2, that value, and then multiply it by Q2. If you're SL, see you later. If you're SL, there are some questions to answer online on Final Site. Make sure you do that as well. If you're HL, we have one more thing to talk about. Let's say that our original supply curve, the one in black, is represented by the formula QS equals 5 plus 4P. So let's ask the question, in what we're seeing here, was it the C variable that changed, or was it the D variable that changed? If the D variable had changed, we would see a different slope to the new supply curve. So it's not the D variable that changed because the new supply curve is parallel. It's a direct translation of the original supply curve. So it must be the C variable that changed. So we see the C variable, this would have been 5 here, and it moved to the right. So we have to expect that the C variable is going to now have a higher value. Again, remember that P in our formula, it's what incentivizes the producer. What the producer is saying in this formula is, every time you raise the price by 1 yen, I will produce 4 more. That's what the producer is saying. So when we add the subsidy in, the subsidy of 1 yen in this case has to be added to P. So what we do is we say that it's not just the price from the consumer that's motivating me. I don't just get the money from the consumer, I also get 1 yen from the government. So it's the price I get from the consumer plus the 1 yen from the government. And we're gonna put that in brackets. Remember though, 4 gets multiplied by each of those, so I have to distribute. So I use the distributive property, and we get from QS equals 5 plus 4P to QS equals 5 plus 4P plus 4, and then I simplify, so QS equals 9 plus 4P. So we see we've gotten the result we want. We know that the C variable had to move to the right, so if this was 5, it had to move to the right, and 9 is to the right of 5.